Welcome to the Amplify RJ podcast feed, coming to you with a new show, Restorative Justice Reflections. Last Friday, we dropped a surprise episode reflecting on episode 3 of The Last of Us, which is a culmination of a project I've been wanting to do for responding to things that we see in media or pop culture that inspire conversations about restorative justice practices, philosophy, and values. On Thursdays, this feed will still feature conversations on the show This Restorative Justice Life with people embodying restorative justice practices in their day-to-day lives. But on Tuesdays for the next couple of weeks, I'll be taking time to have conversations with Kala Mendoza, Director of Mutual Protection at Nonviolent Peace Force, about the restorative themes that we find in the HBO post-apocalyptic drama, The Last of Us. So let's get into it. Restorative Justice Reflections is a show where we take time to reflect on things that are happening in media that provoke restorative questions. The thoughts reflected here are not a critique of the story or production choices of the creators of what we critique, because art is a reflection of people's lived experiences and people are limited by what they know. We don't expect multi-billion-dollar corporations to produce media that is liberatory, and art that reflects this idyllic, perfect world isn't often compelling, but we hope this conversation helps make connections between the themes present in the story and how we can co-create a world where people and communities have what they need to survive and thrive. This week, we're reflecting on episodes 1 through 4 of HBO's post-apocalyptic drama, The Last of Us. Because we dropped a surprise episode last week about episode 3, we thought that this week we would do a first half of the season reflection. So this conversation will be spanning our thoughts on episodes 1, 2, a little bit of 3, and heavily 4. And next week, we'll start taking things one episode at a time. As I was thinking about how to frame this conversation about this post-apocalyptic world where people and infected are causing each other so much harm, the words of Resmaa Menakem were really resonant for me. Trauma decontextualized in a person over time can look like personality. Trauma decontextualized in a family over time can look like family traits. Trauma decontextualized in a people over time can look like culture. So as we drop you into this conversation with Kala and I want to invite you to keep those words in the back of your mind. Here we go.
Welcome back, Kala. We've had such a great response from our community about this episode. I know it's not for everyone, so thank you for sticking with us in this feed. But today we are not only recapping episode 4, we did episode 3 last week, but we didn't start from the beginning with the show. So this is a conversation about episodes 1, 2, we'll work in 3 and 4 of The Last of Us season 1. We've started with learning about, the fungal infection, its origins. We've seen Joel's origin story where he was when the infection really kicked off. And then we've seen him meet Ellie and start the journey across the country with Tess, losing Tess, encountering Bill. So much has happened. Having our background, knowing the game, we know some more context about the things that have happened. And, that part of the conversation is going to be at the very, very end. So no spoilers for what's been shown beyond what's been on the show on HBO right now. But, what are your impressions of the season so far?
It's so good. This really is a faithful adaptation of the show, of the game. I'm really looking forward to what other folks are thinking, what folks are experiencing. The way that it is framed and kind of like the parallels with what's happening now is quite interesting. Yeah. I look forward to 9 p.m. Sunday every week.
6 p.m. Pacific. Well, and honestly, I'm not watching it at 6 p.m. That's getting ready for bedtime with my with my little one. But that's why we get to have these conversations later on. So we have time to digest, reflect, listen to some other people's takes, right? This conversation is not a breakdown of all the Easter eggs and all those things that other people who you may be listening to or watching have. But we're really trying to pull out restorative themes about our collective liberation that we can apply to our lives today. And so, from episode 1 and 2, since we talked about episode 3 last week, as we learned the start of this infection, we learned the origin stories, what were some of the themes that were really present for you or had you thinking about, restorative justice, our collective liberation, all of that?
Yeah, I mean, centrally, and I'll always say this, this is a story about love, right? Mm-hmm. How love can look like when it is generative, or how love can look like when it is more on the inverse, very savior heavy, and not really about thinking about the agency or autonomy of others. I think the main themes for me is, protection. It is how to navigate when you are in a hyper-aroused state constantly and living in a state of trauma and violence. Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, as I was watching, knowing the video game and knowing what was probably coming in this episode 4, what was coming up for me was that there's this scene where, there's a man on the side, a man in the middle of the road pretending that he's hurt. Similarly, in the first episode, we had families crying out to Joel, Tommy, and Sarah at the time for help, and Joel just keeps driving. And, what I think about that when that happens is like, what are the conditions under like which you have no empathy for other people, where you are just out to protect you and yours, however you define that, right? That is selfish love. Like, and we're often in the circumstances where we're talking about like, oh no, like take care of yourself before you take care of others. And like, where are the boundaries of that? Because while that's true, right? If you had stopped to take care of that family on the side of the road, you might have been put in more danger, one, by virtue of stopping, period, right? Like infected could have like come and attacked you. Two, those people could have been infected by, eating the bread, flour, like you don't know, or like you would have been more conspicuous by like traveling in a bigger party, right? But Joel's like, no, it's just going to be us, me, my brother, and my daughter. We're going to keep pushing. Like, where does that come from for him, right? We learn a little bit more context about, him feeling like a protector of not only like Sarah, his daughter, in the first episode, who dies at the hands of Fedra, which, we'll talk about later, but like also of his younger brother, Tommy, as someone who he sees as like, who has a good heart, but like is gullible, naive, is prone to like joining up with causes that like are going to end up putting him in danger. He wants to protect those people that he cares about. And it comes at the expense of all the other people that he leaves behind. And I think like everybody has to decide like how far your people, quote unquote, your people extends out, right? Who are the people that you're going to demonstrate XYZ levels of care to, right? And, I think later in our conversations in this feed, we'll have conversations about pods and like how we can extend care or set boundaries with certain people and like what we're willing to do. But like in post-apocalyptic times, but really even in times like we're navigating now, where we do have finite resources, we do have forces that are operating against us. How are we conscious about the decisions that we're making about when we're extending care or not? It's not as dramatic, but like, the person who's unhoused, panhandling on the corner, like asking for help, like most often I like keep pushing, right? Keep walking. Sometimes like generally there's acknowledgement from my part, like, hey, I see you as a human. I'm not going to contribute like monetarily to like your well-being right now because of, time and convenience. And, I have finite financial resources, and like, that's not a direct parallel to like helping someone who's injured in the apocalypse. But like, how do you navigate like drawing those boundaries for yourself?
Well, I want to take it back a bit in terms of like what has informed this narrative of The Last of Us and a lot of post-apocalyptic dramas that have kind of like a dog-eat-dog mentality. If we look at the book and the film, The Lord of the Flies, right? It tells a story about a group of British schoolboys that basically nearly kill each other because of limited finite resources on a desert island. It's actually based on a true story of Tongan schoolboys who didn't do that. They were on an island by themselves for 18 months. These were folks that were stranded, and rather than coming at each other's throats, they built a community where they had pigs, they had like chickens, they were able to sustain themselves and each other, and they were actually healthier after they were rescued than when they started. So I think this is just really about questioning the tropes or the narratives that we have been fed in a white settler colonial state that says that we have to be against one another, right? As restorative justice, healing justice, and so many frameworks that are built from the work of Black and Indigenous thought leaders, I think it's important for us to think about what is a world that we are trying to build and how can we start practicing that today, right? And I think that's why Amplify RJ and all of the work that y'all do is just so important, because it gives us the practical applications of re-envisioning a world that isn't based in fascism, that isn't based in disposability of anyone in our communities. I think that when we look at what's happening around us, because we are in, it feels like post-apocalyptic times.
Part of it, what it came down to is like, what are the conditions that allow us to be like on this heightened like level where we are working against each other or like being really skeptical of each other, and like how do you now navigate those boundaries to which you extend care, or say like, this is what I can give now, right? It might not be, you're not often driving by somebody on the side of the road like asking for like medical attention, but like we're often encountered with lots of people with needs, and we choose to engage or not. How do you navigate like when to help or not? How do you set those boundaries?
Yeah, I think it's really about doing a self-assessment about what your capacity is to support in the moment. This is one thing that we share with folks that we work with either on the ground protecting at protests or in communities, is doing a self-assessment, like what can I offer for support right now? And that's really knowing, the access to resources that you have that you can extend without depleting yourself in that, whether that's through emotional care and labor or physical protection.
Material resources.
Yeah. Knowing what our resources are, how we can best support, and speaking to those and finding out and really reinforcing the autonomy of someone that we're there to provide mutual aid for. What do they need? And if we're able to meet those needs, to be able to provide those resources.
It's really interesting to see the way that this story has been chosen to be told, right? Pedro Pascal, Chilean by nationality, is white presenting in this framework, right? Thinking about him being a Texan, and not to paint a broad brush, but many of the tropes and stereotypes apply to that version of, one, Texans, two, men like being like emotionally repressed, but like caring deeply in very specific circumstances, like forming deep attachments to specific people and doing whatever it takes to protect. He's been socialized in a certain way, right? Both like I'm someone who like fully grew up in U.S. culture, and while Southern California culture is not the same thing as Texas culture, like many of those same things are apparent to me. But I don't get to navigate the world in the same way because, that's not how I was socialized. As we're thinking about statistically, because I know the Amplify RJ audience, most of the people listening to us right now are not like white presenting men. Also not white presenting men who like have access to guns and like necessarily have that ethic. But like as we're thinking about moving through this world in ways that will keep us safe and provide for the people that we care about, this do it at all costs mentality, even in efforts to, take care of ourselves, take care of each other, like can look really messed up. In the show, we've seen the way that a lot of people, by nature of just surviving, have had to do really shady things that have caused other people harm. And, you can take the common saying among folks on the left, right? There's like no ethical consumption under capitalism. And I think, that's in some way true. Like there's no ethical surviving in like this post-apocalyptic world. But, how do you think about like navigating those boundaries and like when it's okay to cross those, like when is it okay to hurt people in order to like get what you need? That's
a really great question. And I think that it is important for us to look into ourselves and see like, yes, our ancestors we have experienced violence and trauma and have handed it down, but they've also handed down survival, resilience, joy. And I think for me, I always think about how will this impact the world that we are fighting for? Does the theory of what I am doing match the practice of what I am doing? Because if I cause more harm in the long run, is it really, is this really an action I want to take? And I think that it comes up a lot in the show where folks ask, like, what can you do non-violently in this situation? And I think that's a question for folks. It's like, how do we, when we saw Ellie, they've gone through a fascistic schooling that has taught them basically to be a child soldier and to dehumanize others. Seeing Ellie's the beginning to playing with the gun and, even smelling the gunpowder on it, to the moment when they actually had to enact violence, I think it's a question to us about what does it cost us to subscribe to a white settler colonial way of thinking, either when it applies to violence, when it applies to protection. What are the frameworks that we can utilize now and practice now that can inform how we operate in the future? Yeah, I hope that nobody listening to this podcast is ever on like either side of a gun in those situations, right? And like those might not be like the most like applicable frameworks to think about, right? I do think the show does a really good job of like not making it a video game, because like at this point in the video game through episode 4, you've killed hundreds of people probably like thoughtlessly, in this show. Like every person who has been killed, right? You're thinking about like the Fedra soldier who like Joel knew because he was selling him drugs before, or like even the 3 people in this space. And I'm trying to think if any other people were killed in episode 2, but like they did a really good job of like helping us understand that like violence is personal. Like that kind of killing is attached to a person who has a family, who has a story, who's a valued part of community, right? And, Ellie processing, having done that, or at least caused harm,
hurting someone in this time and space like is really reconciling with the cost. I was listening to the official HBO The Last of Us podcast, and as we're thinking about now episode 4, Ellie crying like after she shot the person. One of the creators was talking about how like she wasn't crying because of what she did. She was crying because she didn't feel like she was strong enough to like finish the job. And like, what cost is that this world already taken on this person, where like that's the thing that they're thinking about, not necessarily like Brian and Brian's family. And like, while I just met him and he was trying to hurt me just now, like I have now like set into motion things that will end his life, right? Joel has been dealing with those things for years and years based off of all the things that he's done over the 20 years to survive, right? In his mind, survive. And right, it's a really good framework to think about. So we talked about how, you and I, before we were recording, we're talking about, this line that Joel said to Ellie about like life not being fair, or it's not fair that like she had to do this, like cause harm to someone else in order to like protect him and therefore protect herself. But, there are lots of things about the world that people are born into that aren't fair. And like, climate crisis being one of those things. I think it's really interesting, like in the context of this show, like the way that we see like nature come back and like replace humans. Like it shows like the fragility of like who we are. Like we're not at the center of like the ecosystem that we have on Earth, right? We see like plant life overgrowing a lot of things that we've constructed. But, in episode 4, right, we see a herd of bison, right, that had almost been extinct. And, thinking about the ways that like what our absence as humans, or like the way that we live, the way that can be generative for nature is like, we saw something similar at the beginning of COVID, where, here in Southern California, skies were clear because like not so many people were commuting. And so there was less smog. We think about, fantasy worlds like, Avengers Endgame, right? We saw like with half the world's population gone, like nature coming back in different ways. And while that's not the focus of this show, it's a really important thing for us to like remember and acknowledge like how we are actively altering the ecosystems that we're a part of, oftentimes for harm.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to know if what your audience has experienced, or the narratives that they've heard that are very tied to ecofascism around like if we got rid of all human beings, the world would be better off. But as indigenous water protectors and land defenders have taught us, we are part of an ecosystem with ourselves and our more than human relatives, right? When we saw the bison out there, like I remember cheering up, because having known and learned the history of the eradication of bison on Turtle Island by white settlers, it was an interesting kind of like nod to, kind of like that reclamation by nature, like you were talking about. So in the scene where we saw Joel and Ellie driving down the freeway and they see the bison by the side of the road, to me, that was a really emotional moment, because I think it was a reminder that we as human beings are part of an ecosystem. We are by no means the dominant life form, in spite of the fact that that's been the narrative that we've been told. If we truly listen to indigenous water protectors and land defenders who have been talking about the fact that we can be stewards and we can really hold the responsibility of protecting the world and the climate more seriously, then, The Last of Us and other post-apocalyptic dramas don't have to be prophetic, right? And it's in understanding our relationship to each other, to our more than human relatives, that can really help inform how do we move through this world? How do we identify what our boundaries are when showing protection? How do we communicate what our needs are to each other as a community? It is this show does such a great job of asking us these deeper questions about how would we operate, because in the here and now, it does feel like apocalyptic times for so many communities. How do we practice and build towards a world that we want, that is more just, verdant, and safe?
Yeah, we talked about, fascist forces like Fedra in this case, like Fedra being established as an offshoot probably of the US government that like had the ideas of stopping the spread of infection and keeping people safe, and safe in quotation marks, because a lot of harm was caused, right? We talked about in last week's episode, right? Like quarantine zones being limited and people who couldn't fit in like being shot because like, one, they wouldn't fit, but two, like they wouldn't become infected if they're already dead, right? And so like Fedra is not like this model of like what we want to ascribe to or like aspire to, like to build that like better world, right? But like we also encounter a group here led by Kathleen that, is not Fedra, is probably a group that was like operating in some way, shape, or form autonomously, killing, taking, looting, maybe harvesting like what they needed to survive, took over a Fedra quarantine zone, and is now like inflicting like the same kind of authoritarian, punitive methods that, Fedra had, and maybe even worse. It was really interesting in that scene with the doctor in interrogation, where like she was mocking, the rights that Fedra was supposedly giving to those that they interrogated, including her brother, right? And, she didn't give the doctor those rights. And what was really interesting that I think is really important for restorative justice practitioners to think about is, the doctor saying, and I'm forgetting the line exactly, right? Like, but we can like put all that aside. We're good now. Like, forget like what I've done to like harm your brother. Like, how do we move forward right now in a good way? And there are parts of that line that I resonate with and parts of this line that like aren't quite where I think we should be, right? When we're saying like all of those things that have happened in the past, they don't matter. That's like denying like the pain, the hurt that like Kathleen feels. And I'm not saying that like blood for blood, you did this that caused my brother pain, it caused my brother's death, like you're gonna die. But like you can't like dismiss that pain, just say forget about it, that was in the past, forces out of our control. It's the question of like how do we move forward together in a good way that is generative. But so often when restorative justice has been implemented, or restorative justice programs or restorative justice processes have been introduced, people who are acting from a place of power say, let's forget what happened before this. And like, how do we move forward together in a good way? A really good example is, a kid steals something from a liquor store because they're hungry, right? And they go through a restorative process with the owner of the liquor store, the police, the judge, all those things. Hey, how do we repay the person who lost revenue because you stole, right? Why isn't the question not, what are the conditions that like made you steal in the first place? Like, you're a hungry person, you're a hungry kid. Like, why has this system failed, right? And on an earlier episode of this podcast, and I don't remember which, so this is a terrible callback. We had someone was telling the story of a judge who was working with a case very similar to this, but fined everyone in the courtroom $50 to give to that kid because like we have created this system that has caused the conditions that this young person feels like that they need to steal in order to move forward together in a good way. There is a point where like stealing is not ethically wrong, and those lines are fine and nuanced. But when we're thinking about like the way that resources have been allocated and the ways that resources are legally moved around, like we might constitute some of those things as stealing, right? And like, why is it people who have the least are criminalized for doing things that like are against the law, but like are just trying to meet needs, where other people are doing those things to like hoard wealth? Not a one-to-one comparison with, snitching on somebody to like Fedra authorities ending someone's life. But right, there are conditions under which that happened. Those conditions were maybe under duress, right? The doctor shares that like he's somebody who like has affection, love. She's the person who delivered Kathleen, and she's forgetting all of that and just saying like, no, because you did this thing, you're gonna die.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Like follow-ups. So, as we saw with Kathleen and her group, they replaced the fascistic Fedra, right? In my time on this planet as an organizer and as an activist, I've seen many groups kind of like fall back onto basically using the oppressor's tools to be able to do the work. I'm curious in the work that you've done with different collectives, with different organizations that are trying to navigate through. I was hoping to kind of like tee you up for not like here are some things that apply everywhere, but more here are some things to consider where we don't want to replicate harmful systems.
I think in general, like the framework of addressing harm, instead of saying like, hey, what was the rule that was broken and who did it and how can we punish them? Or like, what does the policy say? What's like the mandatory minimum punishment that gets done? It's, looking at what happened from multiple people's perspectives, who was impacted and how were they impacted. Also, you can also reframe that as like, what was the harm and who was harmed, who was responsible? And then thinking about what needs to be adjusted in order to make it right or as right as possible. People can get jammed up in the what happened of it all because like so much of what we've been socialized to do is like look for like objective capital T truth and like this is exactly what happened and this is why that was wrong. I think that is important, but like we also have to know that everyone remembers things differently. Memory is a tricky thing, and what's important is the impact of those actions. And so like while we may misremember or not have the same perspective of like they said this, they did this, they did that, the impact and feelings that came out of those things are often the things that are highlighting the needs that need to be addressed more than like, this is the exact thing that she said, or this is the exact thing that he said, and this is why I did that. It's also helpful to look into the conditions under which the harm happened. Then maybe you're looking at the policy, like, I thought I was just doing the thing that was right under the policies that we had. And then like you get to this place where you're, as an organization, maybe questioning your policies about why things are that specific way. But I think that's a more direct answer to what you were teeing me up for, yeah?
Yep. Yes. And if I may ask another question completely. So in the scene where we saw Kathleen kind of like galvanizing the revolutionaries or the folks that overthrew and replaced Fedra, if you were part of that group as an advisor to Kathleen, because it seems like it's a very hierarchical situation where she's quite literally hunting down Henry and Sam, what would you do, or what advisement would you give as a trusted advisor within this small unit or group?
About what to do with the doctor, or just in general?
Just in general.
Well, yeah, don't kill a doctor, first of all, right? I mean, like, I don't think I'm going to talk her out of, like, locking him up, but, like, just because he couldn't save that one person doesn't mean like, you couldn't save other people. So what? Don't kill a doctor. You know, I think what we are going to continue to revisit in this season, and because what you and I know about the show and game moving forward is, like, this idea of vengeance. And the cycle of violence. We don't know what Henry and Sam did. We'll find out next week. And like, we don't know in the game either, because like the context of like the way that they introduce these characters is different. And I'm really, really excited to see what happens with, you know, 2 Black characters in this post-apocalyptic world, even though, yeah, I'm just going to shut up because that's going to like give things away. But to go back to like advising Kathleen, you know, we had the scene where her and her lieutenant like saw what was saw some funky things going on underneath the ground, and they chose to ignore that for the time in efforts to like go after, you know, people who she deemed to have like caused some kind of harm to her family, when the more immediate danger was. This is speculation because we don't know, and like this is not a part of the game, so like we don't actually know, but like there's probably some like funky infected stuff going on underneath that floor, so like maybe we should address like our safety, right? Like that self-assessment that you talked about before we like go extend our capacity to like chase down these 2 people who, again, we don't know yet, may have caused us harm, but like our community safety is more important.
Well, thank you. Hey,
Kala, why did the Scarecrow win an award?
I don't know. Why did I?
Because he was outstanding in his field. You know, these are terrible puns, terrible jokes, and like points of connection for Ellie and Joel across the episode, like with some level of annoyance earlier on and less annoyance later. But, you know, what did you think about the use of humor as connection in this space?
Humor is such a powerful way for us to self-regulate and collectively regulate when we're in a hyper-aroused or hypo-aroused state. If we're in fight or flight, freeze or fawn, humor is so humanizing, right? It was beautiful. I don't know. I love puns. It's very like, you know, Filipino elder giving the jokes. I thought it was such a beautiful moment of connection. And once again, it reminds us that even in the time of apocalypse, these humanizing moments, humor, as silly as it may be, reminds us that we are human beings and we do deserve joy. Yeah, what was your take on them?
Well, I mean, I too am a fan of the pun. And, you know, as I really think about like the connection that generates between like Ellie and Joel, right? At the beginning of the episode, like he literally says like, "You're cargo," right? You're not family. To think about where they end up at the end of the episode, not like where like I have like this deep, intense love for you as like a daughter and I'm your father figure, right? But to a point where there is more care, partially because of like the things that the trauma bonding that they're doing, but also because of the familiarity that's being created. I think it's, you know, a really important thing to like not just shut off those parts of us because we're facing serious times, right? Like these are like, even like on our level of discourse around like this pretty serious show, like we are like being pretty serious. That's just generally the way that like I move through the world. But it doesn't mean that like there's not spaces for levity and points of connection. I think like really logistically thinking about like the role of humor in restorative justice or restorative justice processes. I'm thinking back to a time in Circle where an elder talked to me about, you know, the role of humor and making sure that like we're using humor that connects, or instead of like humor that is alienating to people. And right, it's hard to judge whether or not a sentence or a statement or a specific joke is going to cause harm to someone or someone in that space, right? Like we all have our limitations for what we know and limited knowledge about other people and their backgrounds. But like puns generally are a really like safe way to do that. Even though like, okay, but like I intentionally in this conversation like use the scarecrow joke and not the diarrhea one, right? Because like who's that going to turn off in our audience? Probably no one. But let's keep it safe, yeah. Right? Like those are the things that I think about.
Yeah, it's really humor needs to speak to everyone in the room and it can target anyone.
Yeah,
and I think that's the power of it. It's an invitation to joy in these like small moments when we need it. One of my dear comrades and friends we've done on the ground work here in New York and around the country. One of their approaches is to use dance as a form of de-escalation. So I think we all have the ability to infuse moments of intensity, moments of fear with a reminder of our humanity, and that frivolity, that childlike joy is just so important to have. And I'm so glad that they woven that into the story this week.
So we're going to get into like all the things about Sam and Henry next week. I'm like I said, I'm really excited to explore those parts of the story. That was like one of my favorite parts of the game, and I can't wait to see what they come to next. And so we'll be back next week, hopefully on Tuesday, with another reflection, like solely focused on episode 5. We're going to get to like our spoiler corner in a minute, but before we go, you know, one of the reasons that I have you on, Kala, is to talk about, right, is to bring your expertise as a prepper, like, or as you say, a low-key prepper, but like, you know, for people I know, like you're pretty high-key, you're pretty like prepared. And today you put out an Instagram post sharing like what in your go bag was. And so like, let's call this segment Kala's practical, Kala's practical prepper corner. And, you know, share with us, you know, what has come up for you and like how you've thought about prepping for the apocalypse.
Yeah.
Logistically, prepping for the apocalypse.
Well, as a California boy, we are pretty much raised to be prepared for the big one, the big earthquake. I think prepping for me is not so much let me hoard all of these resources and keep them to myself, but rather how do I think about protecting myself while I think about protecting the overall community. I did an interview with Time Magazine at the beginning of this pandemic around disaster preparedness and why it's important for us to think about community first, because we will never survive through any kind of disaster without community. And for me, starting with a go bag is a first step for a lot of folks. And, you know, people may be really overwhelmed with like, where do I start off with, right? And it's once again, starting off with that self-assessment, like looking at what are the likely threats that you might experience, what's a likely risk or harm to yourself, what are your vulnerabilities, and what are your capacities or resources, the resources that you have and the resources that you need. By starting off with that, it'll help kind of give a guidance on how one should prep. So for instance, I live in New York City, in Jackson Heights, Queens. I could walk home in about, an hour from my office. So I know that I'll always need to have shoes at the ready. If there were an EMP blast, knock on wood, or as the Office of Emergency Affairs here in New York was warning us about a nuclear attack, if something were to happen, what are the things I would need to do in order to get home? So prepping is really about planning, and it helps. I'm a very anxious person, and I need to be able to know that I have what I need in order to keep myself safe as I, make sure that my neighbors are safe. So some things that folks might want are questions that folks have had is like, where do I start? Can I, do I need to buy all this stuff at REI? Can I buy this at a, 99-cent store? And first of all, we don't have to buy into consumerism and capitalism when it comes into preparing ourselves for disaster. It really is about looking at what we have access to right now. So if you have extra socks, just putting away, socks into a bag, backpack, if we look at what Joel and Ellie has, like what are the essentials that you need based on your, based on your own respective needs that you've identified? Really quickly, I will just share with folks to think about these three things. You always want to have some form of protection from the elements, whether that is, a poncho, rain poncho, something to protect you from the sun. This can be clothing. This doesn't necessarily need to be like a tent, but thinking about like, how do I protect myself from the elements? How am I going to carry or filter water in the event that one needs to do that? And there's a whole bunch of ways to look at this. We might talk more about this in depth at a later date, but how do I carry and filter water? And then lastly, and I think really importantly, like what's my plan of action? Do I need to get home, like 5 miles away by foot? Do I need to figure out how I'm going to go meet up with my family or those I love? It's really about thinking about what are the things that you need to do in order to protect yourself and others in a time of disaster. But once again, this is going to be very personal to folks. It's going to be highly individual based on your needs, but really kind of starting from what are my likely threats? What are the resources I have access to, and what are the ones that I need? And really slowly building up from there, because you don't want to just go out and just buy a bunch of stuff, right? Yeah. Once again, we don't have to subscribe to disaster capitalism or, just buying things. It's really important to be able to practice what we have, or to identify what we already have, to practice with it, whether it's making sure that, the socks that you have are actually going to last longer than a mile, and really having a plan of action for how to keep yourself safe. So,
yeah.
I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, I think it really is. One of the things that I was thinking as this episode was going is I'd be so screwed without Google Maps, right? Ellie was trying to read a map and this is my second time in a car, man. How am I supposed to know? And I think, in the world that we live in, I can get around my neighborhood and LA freeways decently on my own. But right beyond that, are maps a part of that plan? And it's going to be personal to everyone. We're going to revisit Kala's Practical Prepper Corner as we go on. And so if you have questions, Kala Mendoza on Instagram, they just posted an example of their go bag. So if you want to reference that, you can find them there. Right now, we're inviting everyone who has not played the games and doesn't want spoilers for things to come to sign off. We'll be back in this feed with another episode of This Restorative Justice Life on Thursday, but then back for Restorative Justice Reflections on episode 5 of The Last of Us next week. So this is your warning if you don't want spoilers. All right. When we're thinking about the things to come and this dynamic of, Joel being this person who is now opening up to Ellie, being both through jokes and familiarity, learning how to hold a gun, what came up for you, also knowing where the story goes.
Yeah, because in the show, Joel was I guess you got to learn how to, use it. In the game, he was much more hesitant, right? And very only in the end acquiesced, and in the game was even angry that Ellie had to shoot the hunter or the raider that was on top of him, whereas it was very different in the show. I think that it's interesting how they're portraying Joel in this, and also I'm curious to know kind of what Ellie's Fedra training was, right? Or was there even training on this? Knowing what we know about kind of at that point on the ledge in the game when Joel gives Ellie the rifle to kind of shoot at raiders and walkers, or raiders and infected. How do you see this kind of planning out from the split, or this playing out from the split from the game to the show?
So I just want to make sure that I have the question right. How do I imagine them playing out the dynamic of Joel's willingness to let Ellie enact violence?
Yeah.
I don't know, right? Joel's not a pacifist, but in this game, in the show, Joel shows a lot more. I don't know if I would call it regret, remorse, but it is sensitivity to taking life is hard. And it takes a toll, and wanting to prevent Ellie from being in those situations as much as possible. I think when we think about the game, there are ways to play the game that you take as little life as possible, right? I watched this YouTube playthrough where there's only a handful of points in the game where you actually have to kill people. The sniper scene, that rifle scene, is actually one of those places where the game just forces you to take life. But there's so many other ways that you can just sneak around people, and it might be more or less difficult depending on your skills with the gamepad, but it will be interesting to see how much they lean into violence. This out of control, repressed person whose rage comes out in a moment versus this person who is trying to live as peaceful a life as possible, avoiding detection, avoiding harm, both needing to cause harm and having caused harm, right? Because when Ellie asks him have you killed innocent people, obviously in one framing of the question, the answer is yes. But I would also contend, like, in the framework of nobody is a good or bad guy. We just have like protagonists and antagonists from a certain point of view. To survive this long in this world, as I said earlier in this conversation, you've had to do shady things. You've had to do things that have caused people harm. And so like where they decide to fall on one side or the other of that remains to be seen. Any other spoiler thoughts?
I have so much. Well, no, I don't want to pre-spoil too many things, but I would be curious to know from the audience, would you kind of go in the direction that Joel is going, where it's like you need to protect Ellie at all costs by any means necessary? Or what would you possibly do to kind of be able to protect Ellie, but also to limit harm? I don't know. These are questions that I always think about. You know, I'm not a pacifist either. I believe that we enact violence in many different ways, but I'm all about how do we lessen the harm to ourselves and others, right? Just going back to the show and not necessarily the game.
What was going to be the connection to like this episode or like the first half of the season?
You know, looking at how vengeance plays out for Kathleen, shooting the doctor, like what ends up happening. You know, like we saw Brian and there was someone else, the person I believe that jumped in front of the car first, right? The guy said that they were a goner, right? But were they a doctor? You know? Yeah. So I think it's all about the consequences in order for us, you know, to protect. So like looking at that more personally, like what are the consequences of Joel depriving Ellie of their autonomy and agency in a moment when, you know, but I guess we can talk about that near the end. It's just hard to follow up like episode 3 with, you know, it was just so intense, right? Like, and I think for me as, you know, like I said, middle-aged queer person, the line where older means we're here just kind of like resonated. It's not to say that this was a filler episode by any means, but I think it was like setting up for what's going to be happening in the next episode, which I think is going to be really intense. It's just also I'm getting like the game and the show like mixed up, because I was like, in the game, none of these raiders were a part of a group, or they were just, you know, they were just there to be an obstacle. But in the show, I think we're definitely going to see more depth, and we don't have Kathleen, we don't have like the lieutenant. I'm just curious to see kind of like where the writers kind of take this. So anyway.
Yeah, you know, we talked about how, you know, Joel's mission right now is like to get Ellie to where she needs to go, but like that's not really his mission. His mission is like still to find Tommy, find his brother, right? And it's interesting to see how like the character development will play out. Like what are the beats, what are the things that will happen that like continues to build that relationship with Ellie, right? There's going to be a lot more that happens, and you know he's gonna eventually like try to pawn off Ellie on Tommy. At least that's what happens in the game, right? Because Tommy's a Firefly, you can go finish this mission. But you know, what are the trauma bonds, or like what are the like actual other bonds that's gonna like have him, you know, really decide that like, no, it is my responsibility to protect or at least like see this through, because like he's not there yet. Like, you know, empowering her with a firearm right now is a matter of practicality, not about like care.
Yeah.
So many more things to talk about within the context of the show. I'm really excited to come back next week. Take care till then.